Power in England was never held by kings alone. For one extraordinary generation, much of it belonged to the Seymours. Some families are born to greatness. Others stumble into it by chance, or by a single fortunate marriage, or by the simple accident of catching a king's eye at the right moment. The Seymours were none of these things, at least not for the first 300 years of their story. They were country gentry, keepers of a royal forest, men who served as sheriffs and local officials, and who married well enough to hold their place, but never well enough to rise above it. For centuries they tended their lands in Wiltshire, looked after the ancient trees of Savernake, and watched greater families rise and fall around them without ever expecting to join them. And then, in the space of a single decade, everything changed. One quiet daughter married the most powerful king in Europe. One ambitious brother became the ruler of England in all but name. Another brother married a queen and reached for the crown itself. And in the wreckage that followed, 2 of the 3 were dead. One by disease, the other 2 by the executioner's axe. Tonight, we tell the whole story of their long rise and sudden fall, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Seymour and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history, unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Seymour story surprised you the most, help these stories find others who need them. Long before anyone in England had heard the name Seymour, there was a family called St. Maur. The name was French, Norman French to be precise, and it came, as so many things in medieval England did, from across the Channel. There was a village in Normandy, not far from a town called Avranches, named Saint-Maur-sur-Loire, and it was from this place, or so the family later claimed, that their ancestors had first come to England. Whether they truly arrived with William the Conqueror in 1066, as some accounts suggest, or whether they drifted across the water somewhat later, is a question that belongs more to family legend than to documented history. What we can say with certainty is that by the 12th century, a family bearing the name St. Maur had established itself in the borderlands between England and Wales, at a modest stone fortress called Penhow Castle in Monmouthshire. Penhow was not a grand place. It was a border castle, built for defence rather than for display, and the family who held it were minor lords in every sense of the word. The parish church that stood nearby was dedicated to St. Maur, a quiet marker of the family's presence in the land. And from this small corner of South Wales, the St. Maurs began their long, slow climb into English history. They were tenants of the great Marcher lords who controlled the Welsh frontier, men of modest means who held their land by service and by loyalty, rather than by any great wealth or distinction of their own. In the wider currents of English politics, they were invisible. No chronicler mentioned them. No king summoned them to council. They lived, they served, they married, they died, and the world took no particular notice. The first moment that brings the family into anything like a clear historical light comes around the year 1240. In that year, Gilbert Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke, helped a man named William St. Maur to acquire a small estate called Woundy, or Undy as it would later be known, near Caldecott in Monmouthshire. This was not a great lordship. It was a single manor, one from the last native Welsh Prince of Gwent, and it came to the St. Maurs not by conquest or by royal favour, but by the kind of quiet local arrangement that the great Marcher lords made every day. The agreement that sealed the transfer bore the coat of arms that would become the hallmark of the Seymour family for centuries to come, a pair of golden wings. And from this modest beginning, from a single manor on the Welsh border, the family began to grow. For the next century and a half, the St. Maurs remained in Monmouthshire, accumulating land by careful marriages and patient service. They were not rich, they were not powerful, they were simply there, generation after generation of minor gentry, tending their estates, marrying their neighbours' daughters, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, extending the boundaries of their holdings. It was the kind of progress that would have been invisible to anyone watching from the great courts of England, but which, over the span of many lifetimes, could transform a family's fortunes entirely. The transformation, when it came, arrived in the form of a woman. Sometime around the year 1390, a member of the St. Maur family, by now the name was beginning to be written as Seymour, an English corruption of the Norman original, married into the Beauchamp family of Somerset. The Beauchamp were a grander family altogether, barons who had been summoned to Parliament since 1299 and who held the feudal barony of Hatch-Beauchamp in the rolling countryside of that western county. The marriage brought the Seymours their first real connection to the English peerage, and it gave them something more, a foothold outside of Wales, in the gentler and more prosperous lands of the English West Country. But the marriage that truly changed everything came a generation later. Around the turn of the 15th century, a young man named Roger Seymour married a woman named Maud Estamy. Maud was the daughter, and crucially the co-heiress, of a man named Sir William Estamy, and Sir William was a figure of considerable local importance. He had served as Speaker of the House of Commons, one of the most prestigious positions in parliamentary England. He had held positions in the royal households of Princess Blanche and of Joan of Navarre, the consort of King Henry IV. He sat on the King's Council, and he held by hereditary right one of the most ancient and prestigious local offices in all of Wiltshire, the Wardenship of Savernake Forest. This was a marriage that lifted the Seymours from the ranks of the anonymous into the ranks of the locally significant. Sir William Estamy was not a great lord, but he was a man of substance, a man who had stood before Parliament and spoken on behalf of the Commons of England, a man who had served in the intimate circles of the royal household, a man whose name appeared in the records of the Crown. And when his daughter married a Seymour, all of his connections, all of his lands, all of his offices passed into the Seymour family along with her. The wardenship itself was not merely an administrative title. It carried with it real authority, real revenue, and real prestige. The warden was responsible for the management of thousands of acres of ancient forest, the protection of the king's deer, the regulation of timber cutting, the enforcement of the forest laws that governed the use of this vast natural resource. He had his own courts, his own officers, and his own jurisdiction, and he was, by virtue of his office, a figure of authority in the local community, a man to whom the tenants and farmers who lived around the forest looked for leadership and for justice. Savernake was no ordinary stretch of woodland. It was a remnant of primeval forest, a vast and ancient expanse of oak and beech that had been designated a royal forest soon after the Norman conquest. When the kings of England came to hunt in Wiltshire, it was in Savernake that they found their sport, and it was to nearby Marlborough Castle that their great retinues retired at the end of the day. The warden of Savernake was the man who kept the forest, who managed its game, who maintained its boundaries, and who, most importantly, served as the host and companion of the king whenever the royal hunting party rode into Wiltshire. It was a position that brought its holder into direct, personal contact with the crown, and it had been in the Estamy family for generations. When Roger Seymour married Maud Estamy, All of this passed into the Seymour family, the Wardenship, the lands, the ancient house that stood at the edge of the forest, in a place called Wolfhall, or Wolfhall as it was sometimes written. And with the inheritance came something that no amount of money could have bought: proximity to the king. The Seymours were no longer Welsh border gentry. They were Wiltshire landowners, keepers of a royal forest, men whose duty brought them face to face with the monarch himself. Their seat had moved from Undy in Monmouthshire to Wolfhall in Wiltshire, and with that move, the whole trajectory of the family shifted. It would be wrong to suggest that the Seymours became important overnight. They did not. For the better part of the 15th century, they remained what they had always been: solid, respectable, provincial. They served as sheriffs, they managed their estates, they married into other families of similar standing, and produced sons who did much the same. The name Seymour appeared in the heralds' visitation rolls, in the records of local courts, in the lists of men appointed to this or that minor office, and nowhere else. If you had asked anyone at the court of Henry VI, or of Edward IV, or of Richard III who the Seymours were, you would have received a blank look or, at best, a vague reference to the wardens of some forest in Wiltshire. But the Seymours were building something even if they did not know it. With each generation, their network of connections grew slightly wider. With each fortunate marriage, their landholdings grew slightly larger. And, through Margery Wentworth, the woman who would marry the last Sir John Seymour before the Great Transformation, they could claim a descent from the royal blood of England itself, through a line that ran back through the Wentworths to Henry Percy, the famous Hotspur, and through Hotspur's wife Elizabeth Mortimer to the Plantagenet kings. It was a thin thread of royal blood, stretched across many generations and diluted by many marriages. But it was there, and it would matter in the end more than anyone could have guessed. For the moment, however, the Seymours were simply a family of country gentry, living in a fine old house at the edge of an ancient forest, looking after the king's deer and waiting, though they did not know they were waiting, for the moment that would change everything. The man who presided over the Seymour family at the dawn of the 16th century was Sir John Seymour, born around 1473 or 1474, into the comfortable obscurity that his ancestors had occupied for generations. Sir John was, by the standards of his time and his station, a thoroughly respectable figure. He inherited the wardenship of Savernake Forest in 1491, when he was still a young man, and from that point forward he threw himself into the life of service and local administration that was expected of a man in his position. He served as Sheriff of Wiltshire on no fewer than 4 occasions: in 1498, 1507, 1518, and again in 1524. And he held the same office for Somerset and Dorset as well. He was a Knight of the Body to King Henry VIII, which meant that he was one of the gentlemen who attended the king in person, and he held the further distinction of being a groom of the bedchamber, a position that brought him into the most intimate circles of the royal household. Sir John was, by all accounts, a man of action as well as a man of the court. In 1497, when the Cornish rebels marched on London in protest against the taxes levied to fund a war with Scotland, Sir John was among the men who fought them at the Battle of Blackheath. His courage on the field was noticed, and he was knighted by King Henry VII himself, a mark of royal favour that cemented the family's loyalty to the Tudor dynasty and announced to the world that the Seymours were no longer mere country squires. They were men who had bled for the crown, and the crown had seen fit to reward them. In the years that followed, Sir John continued to build his career through the steady accumulation of offices and connections. He served on local commissions, settled disputes between his neighbours, managed the affairs of the forest, and appeared at court with sufficient regularity to maintain his position in the king's favour. When Henry VIII succeeded his father in 1509, Sir John transferred his loyalty seamlessly to the new king, as men of his class were expected to do. And the new king, who was young, energetic and fond of hunting, proved to be a more frequent visitor to Savernake Forest than his cautious and parsimonious father had ever been. The Seymours' duty as wardens of the forest brought them, once again, into direct contact with the monarch, and Sir John made the most of the opportunity. It was not a glittering career. Sir John never held high office. He was never sent on a major diplomatic mission. He was never given command of an army or entrusted with a great affair of state. But he was present, always present, in the way that loyal minor courtiers were expected to be. At the great events of Henry's early reign, he attended the king. He managed his forest. He raised his family. And he waited patiently and without any particular expectation of greatness for whatever the future might bring. But Sir John's greatest contribution to the Seymour story was not his military service or his administrative career. It was his marriage. Sometime in the last years of the 15th century or the first years of the 16th, he married a woman named Margery Wentworth, and between them they produced a family that would shake the foundations of English history. Margery was the daughter of Sir Henry Wentworth of Nettlestead, in Suffolk, a family of some distinction with connections that reached considerably higher than the Seymours' own. Through her mother's line, Margery could trace her ancestry back to King Edward III, and the poet John Skelton, who knew her, praised her beauty and her gentle nature in verse. She was, by the standards of her time, an excellent match for Sir John, perhaps even a slightly ambitious one, and together they set about the business of raising a large and, as it would prove, remarkably consequential family. Sir John and Margery had 10 children in all. Of these, 6 survived to adulthood, a rare feat in an age when childhood mortality claimed so many. The sons were John, Edward, Henry, Thomas, and 2 others. The daughters were Jane, Elizabeth, Margery, and Dorothy. It was a busy, crowded household full of the noise and activity that 10 children inevitably produce, and it was centred on Wolf Hall, the old house at the edge of Savernake Forest where the Seymours had lived since the days of Maud Estermy. Wolf Hall itself was not a grand palace. It was a manor house, comfortable and spacious enough for a family of gentry, but lacking the towers and battlements and great halls that marked the homes of the truly powerful. The Seymours' world revolved around the forest, the estate, the nearby villages, and the seasonal rhythms of agricultural life in rural Wiltshire. When Henry VIII came to hunt in Savernake, as he did from time to time, the household would erupt into activity, preparing food and lodging and entertainment for the king and his enormous retinue. But between these royal visits, life at Wolf Hall was quiet, provincial, and unremarkable. It was into this world that the children of Sir John and Margery Seymour grew up. They learned to read and write. They were taught the skills expected of their station, needlework and household management for the girls, horsemanship and the rudiments of military service for the boys. They attended church. They played in the forest. And they grew, year by year, into the men and women who would one day stand at the very centre of English power. But before we follow them to court and to greatness, there is a darker chapter in the Seymour story that must be told, a chapter that was hushed up in its own time, and that has been debated by historians ever since. Sometime around the year 1518 or 1519, the eldest surviving Seymour son, Edward, married a young woman named Catherine Fillol. Catherine was the daughter of Sir William Fillol of Woodlands in Horton, Dorset, a respectable family of the same gentry class as the Seymours themselves. It was a sound match, the kind of marriage that families like theirs arranged as a matter of course, and for a few years it seems to have proceeded without incident. Catherine bore Edward 2 sons, a boy named John, born around 1527, and another named Edward, born around 1529 or 1530. And then something went wrong. The details are maddeningly unclear, buried beneath layers of discretion, legal manoeuvring, and the passage of centuries. What we know for certain is this. In 1527, Catherine's father, Sir William Fillol, made a will in which he deliberately and pointedly disinherited both Catherine and her husband Edward Seymour. The language of the will is stark. It directs that, for many diverse causes and considerations, neither Catherine nor her heirs, nor Sir Edward Seymour, her husband, shall have any part or parcel of his manors or estates. Instead, Catherine was left a modest annual pension of £40, but only on the condition that she live virtuously and abide in some house of religion of women. In other words, a convent. Something had clearly gone very badly wrong in the marriage, and the most widely repeated explanation is also the most scandalous. A marginal note in a copy of Vincent's Baronage, held at the College of Arms and dating from the 17th century, states bluntly that Catherine was repudiated by her husband because her father-in-law, Sir John Seymour himself, had known her after the marriage. The Latin is unambiguous. The implication is that Catherine had had an affair with her own father-in-law. It is a shocking allegation, and it must be treated with considerable care. There is no contemporary evidence to support it. No letter, no court record, no chronicle from the time mentions any such scandal. The marginal note was written more than a century after the events it describes, and its author is unknown. Some historians, notably Alison Weir, have accepted the story as credible, arguing that the severity of Edward's reaction and the unusual terms of Fillol's will point to something far worse than ordinary infidelity. Others, notably Susan Higginbotham, have pointed out that Sir John Seymour had an illegitimate son, also named John, whose existence may have caused confusion with Catherine's son of the same name, and that there is no contemporary evidence of any hostility between Sir John and his eldest son. What can be said with confidence is this. Catherine Fillol was repudiated by Edward Seymour at some point in the late 1520s or early 1530s. She appears to have entered a convent as her father's will directed. Edward did not acknowledge the paternity of her two sons, and Catherine herself was dead by early 1535, for in that year, or possibly slightly before, Edward Seymour married again. His second wife was Anne Stanhope, a woman whose pride, intelligence, and forceful personality would make her one of the most remarkable and most controversial women of the Tudor age. Anne was the daughter of Sir Edward Stanhope, and through her mother, Elizabeth Bourchier, she was a direct descendant of Thomas of Woodstock, the youngest son of King Edward III. She was, in other words, a woman of considerably grander blood than the Seymours themselves, and she brought to her marriage a fierce ambition and a sense of her own dignity that would later bring her into open conflict with a queen. But all of that lay in the future. For now, in the mid-1530s, the Seymour household at Wolf Hall was simply a large and increasingly well-connected family of Wiltshire gentry, with a father who served at court, a mother of gentle birth, and a cluster of children who were just beginning to make their way in the world. The eldest son, Edward, was already carving out a career as a soldier and courtier. The younger son, Thomas, was growing into a handsome, charming, and dangerously ambitious young man. And the eldest daughter, a quiet, pale, seemingly unremarkable young woman named Jane, was about to catch the eye of the most powerful man in England. Sir John Seymour himself did not live to see his family's transformation. He died in December 1536, just months after his daughter's marriage to the king, long enough to know that the Seymours had been lifted into a world he could never have imagined, but not long enough to see what that world would do to them. Of all the women who married King Henry VIII, Jane Seymour is perhaps the most difficult to know. She left behind no letters that have survived, no diary, no memoir. No record of her thoughts or her feelings in her own words. What we have instead are the observations of others, diplomats, courtiers, ambassadors, men who watched her from the outside and described what they saw. A quiet woman, pale and composed, neither beautiful nor plain, who moved through the dangerous world of the Tudor court with a kind of careful stillness that seemed, to some, like modesty, and to others, like calculation. Jane was born around the year 1508 or 1509. The exact date, like so much about her, is unknown. At Wolf Hall, the Seymour family home in Wiltshire. She was the eldest daughter of Sir John Seymour and Margery Wentworth, and she grew up in the same comfortable provincial world that all the Seymour children knew. A world of forest and field, of parish churches and local markets, of needlework and household management and the slow turning of the agricultural year. She learned to read and write, as was expected of a gentlewoman of her station, but she was not, by the standards of her time, well educated. She had none of the intellectual brilliance that had distinguished Catherine of Aragon, none of the quick wit and sharp tongue that had marked Anne Boleyn. She was, by all appearances, a thoroughly ordinary young woman from a thoroughly ordinary family. And yet, there was something about Jane, something in her quietness, her reserve, her apparent lack of ambition, that would prove to be exactly what Henry VIII was looking for, at exactly the moment he was looking for it. Jane's entry into the world of the court came around the year 1529, when she was appointed as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. It was a standard position for a young gentlewoman, one of a group of women who attended the Queen, kept her company, assisted with her wardrobe, and participated in the entertainments and ceremonies of the court. There was nothing unusual about the appointment. Young women from families like the Seymours were sent to court as a matter of course, to learn the manners and skills they would need in their adult lives and, if fortune smiled, to attract the attention of a suitable husband. For most of them, a few years at court would end in a respectable marriage to a man of their own class, and they would return to the country to raise families of their own. That was the expected trajectory, and there was no reason to suppose that Jane's story would be any different. Jane served Catherine of Aragon faithfully, and by all accounts she learned much from the older woman. The dignity, the patience, the quiet fortitude that Catherine displayed even as her marriage crumbled around her, and her husband turned his attentions to another woman. When the Queen was set aside and Anne Boleyn took her place, Jane transferred her service to the new Queen. She became one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, attending her in the same capacity as she had attended Catherine, fetching, carrying, sewing, listening, and watching. Always watching. She was a quiet presence in a noisy court, a woman who said little but missed nothing, who moved through the corridors of power with the kind of careful invisibility that only the truly observant can achieve. Nobody paid particular attention to Jane Seymour. She was simply there, another face among the ladies, another pair of hands at the needlework, another quiet voice in the Queen's apartments. And perhaps that was the most remarkable thing about her, that she could be so thoroughly invisible in a world where every other woman was fighting to be seen. It was during this period, sometime in 1535, when Henry and Anne Boleyn visited the Seymour family at Wolf Hall during a royal progress through the West Country, that the king appears to have first noticed Jane. The visit took place in September of that year, and by the following February, rumours of Henry's attraction to Jane were circulating through the court. The timing was significant. Anne Boleyn had failed by this point to give Henry what he wanted most in all the world, a living son. She had borne him a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, in September 1533, but she had also suffered at least 2 miscarriages, the most recent in January 1536. Henry was 54 years old. He had broken with Rome, destroyed the power of the monasteries, executed his closest advisers, and torn his kingdom apart. all in pursuit of a male heir. And Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom he had done all of these things, had not delivered one. Jane Seymour offered Henry something that he had not found in either of his previous wives: submission. Where Catherine of Aragon had been proud and defiant, and Anne Boleyn had been sharp-tongued and passionate, Jane was gentle, obedient, and apparently without ambition. She did not argue with the king. She did not challenge him. She did not put herself forward. She simply waited, quietly and patiently, for whatever the king might choose to give her. There is a story, repeated by several near-contemporary sources, that when Henry sent Jane a purse of gold coins and a letter, she returned both unopened, falling to her knees and saying that she could not accept such a gift, that she was a gentlewoman of good and honourable parents, and that she had no greater treasure in the world than her honour, which she would not injure for 1,000 deaths. It was, of course, exactly the right thing to say. Whether Jane genuinely believed it, or whether she had been coached, by her brothers perhaps, who were already manoeuvring to advance the family's interests, is a question that historians have debated ever since. What is certain is that Jane's refusal to become the king's mistress, combined with her apparent modesty and virtue, only increased Henry's desire for her. The king began to see in Jane everything that he had once seen in Catherine and in Anne, a woman who would give him a son, but without the complications that had attended his previous marriages. Jane was quiet. Jane was obedient. Jane would do as she was told. It is worth pausing here to consider the role that Jane's brothers played in all of this. Edward and Thomas Seymour were not idle spectators in their sister's courtship with the king. They were, by this point, experienced courtiers who understood the mechanisms of power at the Tudor court, and they were perfectly aware that their sister's relationship with Henry represented the greatest opportunity the Seymour family had ever been offered. The extent of their involvement in managing the courtship is debated by historians. Some see them as active stage managers, coaching Jane in every word and gesture, while others argue that Jane's behaviour was her own, the natural expression of a genuinely modest and reserved personality. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Jane was not a puppet, but neither was she acting entirely alone. The Seymour brothers had everything to gain from her success, and they were not the kind of men to leave such things to chance. There was also a political dimension to Henry's attraction that went beyond the personal. Jane was sympathetic to the old religion in a way that Anne Boleyn, a committed reformer, had never been. She was close to the Princess Mary, who had suffered greatly under Anne's influence, and her gentle, conservative temperament appealed to those at court who had grown weary of the religious upheaval and political turmoil that had accompanied the king's break with Rome. In choosing Jane, Henry was sending a signal, whether he intended to or not, that the excesses of the Boleyn years were over and that a return to stability and tradition was at hand. The German painter Hans Holbein the Younger painted Jane's portrait around this time, probably in 1536 or 1537, and the image he captured has become one of the most familiar faces of the Tudor era. Jane stares out from the painting with a pale, composed expression, her hands folded demurely before her, her gown heavy with gold and jewels. It is a face that reveals almost nothing. No warmth, no passion, no hint of the extraordinary drama that was unfolding around her. Some have read in it the calm self-possession of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Others have seen only blankness. The face of a woman who had been placed in a position she did not fully understand and was doing her best to survive it. As with so much about Jane Seymour, we are left with the image, but not the person behind it. The fall of Anne Boleyn came with a speed and a violence that still has the power to shock. On the 2nd of May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, charged with adultery, incest, and treason, charges that most historians today regard as either wholly fabricated or grossly exaggerated. On the 19th of May, she was beheaded on Tower Green by a French swordsman specially brought over for the occasion. The next day, the very next day, before the echoes of that terrible morning had faded, Henry and Jane were formally betrothed. 11 days later, on the 30th of May, they were married in a private ceremony at Whitehall Palace. The speed of the transition was breathtaking, even by the standards of a court that had grown accustomed to Henry's marital upheavals. One queen was dead, another was already in her place. Jane Seymour was Queen of England. The marriage of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour took place on the 30th of May, 1536, in the Queen's Closet at Whitehall Palace. It was a quiet ceremony, far removed from the pomp and spectacle that had attended the King's marriage to Anne Boleyn 3 years earlier. There were no great tournaments, no elaborate pageants, no barges festooned with banners on the Thames. The King was 54 years old, twice divorced, or, as he would have seen it, twice widowed, since in his eyes both previous marriages had been annulled. And he wanted a wife, not a spectacle. On the 4th of June, Jane was proclaimed Queen, and the court turned its attention to the business that mattered above all else: the production of a male heir. Jane's time as Queen was brief, barely 17 months, but in that short span she made an impression that outlasted her life. She was, by all accounts, a dutiful and obedient wife, careful never to contradict the king in public, and mindful of the fate that had befallen her predecessor. When Henry warned her early in their marriage not to meddle in politics, Jane took the lesson to heart. She chose as her motto, "Bound to obey and serve," a deliberate contrast to Anne Boleyn's defiant, "the most happy." And she conducted herself with a quiet dignity that won the approval of the court and the affection of the people. But Jane was not entirely passive. She used her influence carefully and discreetly to achieve something that neither Catherine of Aragon nor Anne Boleyn had been able to accomplish in their years as queen: the reconciliation of Henry with his eldest daughter, Mary. Princess Mary had been declared illegitimate following the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and she had spent years in disgrace, separated from her father and subjected to petty humiliations at the hands of Anne Boleyn and her supporters. Jane, who was sympathetic to Mary and who perhaps saw in her a kindred spirit, another quiet, dutiful woman navigating the treacherous waters of Henry's court, worked patiently to restore her to her father's favour. And she succeeded. Mary was brought back to court, reinstated in the line of succession, and treated once again as a princess of England. It was a quiet achievement, and it is one of the few things we know about Jane's queenship with any certainty. The rest of her time as queen is largely a blank, a series of court ceremonies, religious observances, and private moments that went unrecorded. Jane did not write books, as Catherine Parr would later do. She did not engage in theological debates, as Anne Boleyn had done. She did not patronize artists or scholars or reformers. She simply lived, day by day, in the enormous and suffocating world of the Tudor court, waiting for the one thing that would secure her position, her family's fortune, and the future of the Tudor dynasty. By the spring of 1537, it became clear that Jane was pregnant. The news was greeted with something approaching national euphoria. Henry had been seeking a male heir for more than 20 years, through 2 marriages, a break with Rome, and the destruction of the English monasteries. And now, at last, it seemed that his prayers might be answered. Jane was carefully looked after, her diet monitored, her activities restricted, her every movement watched and worried over by a court that understood, perhaps better than she did herself, how much was riding on the life she carried. Cravings were indulged. Special foods were procured. The Queen was given every comfort that the vast resources of the Tudor court could provide, because everyone, from the king to the lowest servant, understood that the child Jane carried was not merely a baby. It was the future of England. The months of waiting were tense. Henry, who had endured the disappointment of 2 wives and the anguish of multiple miscarriages, alternated between hope and dread. He had the Queen's chambers at Hampton Court specially prepared, the walls hung with rich tapestries and the rooms supplied with every luxury. Prayers were said in churches across the kingdom for the Queen's safe delivery. And through it all, Jane waited, patient, quiet, obedient to the end, for the moment that would define her life and her family's destiny. The labour began on the 7th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. It was long and agonising, lasting by some accounts for nearly 3 days. And there were moments when it seemed that neither mother nor child would survive. The physicians and midwives who attended Jane must have felt the weight of the entire kingdom pressing upon them, for they knew that the failure of this birth could plunge England back into the dynastic uncertainty that Henry had spent his entire reign trying to escape. But in the early hours of the 12th of October, which fell that year on the eve of the feast of St. Edward the Confessor, Jane delivered a healthy baby boy. He was named Edward, after the saint on whose feast day he was born, and his arrival was greeted with a joy that bordered on delirium. Bonfires were lit across England. Bells were rung in every parish church. Te Deum of thanksgiving were sung in the cathedrals. The cannons of the Tower of London fired 2,000 rounds, and the streets of the capital were filled with processions and celebrations that lasted for days. Henry was beside himself with happiness. After more than 2 decades of anguish, frustration, and the most extraordinary upheaval in English history, he had his son. The Tudor dynasty was secure. The baby was christened on the 15th of October in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, in a ceremony of great splendour. His half-sister Mary served as his godmother. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer presided over the baptism. And the Seymour family, Edward Thomas and their father Sir John, who had died the previous year, were elevated, ennobled, and enriched beyond anything their ancestors could have dreamed. Edward Seymour was created Viscount Beauchamp 3 days after the christening. He would soon be made Earl of Hertford as well. But amid the celebrations, a shadow was falling. Jane had not recovered from the birth. The details of her illness are not entirely clear. The sources speak of fever, of pain, of a condition that worsened steadily in the days following the delivery. But it is now generally believed that she developed puerperal fever, the great killer of women in childbirth in the centuries before modern medicine. She rallied briefly, well enough to sit up in bed and receive guests on the day of the christening. But by the 18th of October she was gravely ill, and by the 21st it was clear that she was dying. Jane Seymour, Queen of England, died on the 24th of October 1537 at Hampton Court Palace. She was approximately 28 or 29 years old. She had been queen for 17 months. She had been a mother for 12 days. Henry was devastated. Whatever else may be said about his marriages, and much has been said and much of it is damning, his grief for Jane appears to have been genuine and deep. He wore black for 3 months, an unusually long period of mourning for a king, and he ordered that Jane be buried with the full honours due to a queen at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Years later, when he sat for the great dynastic portrait by Hans Holbein that depicted Henry with his 3 wives and his son, it was Jane. Not Catherine, not Anne, not any of the 3 wives who came after her, whom the artist placed at the king's side. And when Henry himself died in January 1547, he was laid to rest beside Jane at Windsor, in accordance with his own express wish. She was, he said, his true wife, the one who had given him what he wanted most. The funeral took place on the 12th of November, 1537, in a procession that wound its way from Hampton Court to Windsor. Jane's body was placed on a chariot drawn by 6 horses, covered in black velvet and gold, and attended by hundreds of mourners in black. The route was lined with torchbearers, their flames flickering in the November darkness, and the bells of every church along the way rang out as the cortege passed. It was a solemn and magnificent farewell, the kind of funeral that was reserved for queens who had served the realm well. At Windsor, Jane was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel, in a vault beneath the choir. It was one of the most sacred spaces in England, the spiritual home of the Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in the realm. And Jane's burial there was a statement of the value that Henry placed upon her memory. She was not simply his third wife. She was, in his eyes, the wife who had mattered most, the one who had fulfilled the purpose for which he had upended the religious and political life of an entire nation. In the years that followed, Henry's devotion to Jane's memory remained constant, even as he married 3 more times. Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, each of whom, in her own way, failed to replace Jane in the king's affections. It was Jane whom the artist Hans Holbein placed beside Henry in the great dynastic portrait that depicted the Tudor family, not Catherine or Anne or any of the 3 wives who followed her. And it was Jane whom Henry chose to lie beside for all eternity, directing in his will that his body be interred in the same vault at Windsor where Jane had been laid to rest. When Henry died in January 1547, his wishes were honoured, and the king who had torn England apart in pursuit of a male heir was laid to rest beside the woman who had given him one. For the Seymour family, Jane's death was a catastrophe wrapped inside a triumph. She had given them everything: a nephew who was heir to the throne, titles, lands, royal favour. But she was also their most powerful connection to the king, and without her, their hold on power was suddenly dangerously fragile. Edward Seymour, now Earl of Hertford, remained at court and continued to build his career in military and administrative service. Thomas Seymour was sent abroad on diplomatic missions, but neither of them could be certain in the years that followed Jane's death that the great elevation of their family would last. As it turned out, it would last for exactly another 15 years. And in those 15 years, the Seymour family would reach heights of power that would have seemed unimaginable to their ancestors at Wolf Hall, and they would be destroyed by it. Edward Seymour, the eldest surviving son of Sir John and Margery, had been preparing for power his entire adult life, even if he had not known it. Born around the year 1500, he had entered the world of the court as a teenager, serving as a child of honour in the household of Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, when she travelled to France in 1514 to marry King Louis XII. He had studied at Oxford and Cambridge. He had accompanied the Duke of Suffolk on a military campaign in France in 1523 and been knighted on the field for his valour. He had served as Master of Horse to Henry Fitzroy, the king's illegitimate son, and as an esquire of the body to the king himself. He was, in short, exactly the kind of man that the Tudor system was designed to produce. A loyal, capable, ambitious servant of the crown, whose career was built on a foundation of military service, administrative competence, and unfailing obedience to the royal will. When his sister married the king in 1536, Edward's career accelerated dramatically. He was created Viscount Beauchamp on the 5th of June 1536, just days after the wedding, and Earl of Hertford on the 15th of October 1537, 3 days after the birth of his nephew, Prince Edward. He continued to serve the king in military affairs, and in May 1544 he was entrusted with the command of an English army that was sent to Scotland to enforce Henry's demand that the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, be betrothed to Prince Edward. This campaign, part of what historians would later call the Rough Wooing, saw Hertford burn Edinburgh and lay waste to the Scottish lowlands. It was a brutal business, but it earned Hertford a reputation as a capable and ruthless military commander, and it cemented his position as one of the most powerful men in England. When Henry VIII died in the early hours of the 28th of January, 1547, the 9-year-old Prince Edward became King Edward VI. And the question of who would govern the country during his minority became the most important question in English politics. It was a question that men had been asking, quietly and nervously, for years, because everyone at court understood that a child king was a dangerous thing. Dangerous for the country, which would be ruled by others in the boy's name, and dangerous for the men who would compete for the right to do the ruling. Henry had made provision for a regency in his will, naming 16 executors who were to act as a council of equals, sharing power collectively until the young king came of age. Edward Seymour was one of these 16 men, but he was not, in Henry's design, intended to be their leader. The will had been carefully drafted to prevent any single man from dominating the council. Henry, who had seen what overbearing ministers could do during the reign of his own father, was determined that his son would be served by a committee, not by a dictator. What happened next was a masterclass in political maneuvering, a demonstration of the kind of swift, decisive action that would characterize Edward Seymour's protectorate and, ultimately, contribute to his downfall. Within days of Henry's death, Edward Seymour had persuaded the other executors to agree to a fundamental change in the arrangements. Instead of governing collectively, as Henry had intended, the council would appoint a single man to serve as Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person. And that man, naturally, would be Edward Seymour himself. How he achieved this is not entirely clear. Some of the other councillors were bought off with promises of titles and lands, promises that Seymour honoured promptly, distributing honours and estates with a generosity that suggests he had planned the whole thing in advance. Others may simply have been persuaded by the practical argument that a council of 16 equals was a recipe for paralysis, and that a single strong hand was needed to guide the kingdom through the dangerous early years of a child king's reign. Whatever the means, the result was swift and decisive. On the 4th of February, 1547, barely a week after Henry's death, Edward Seymour was formally appointed Lord Protector. 12 days later, on the 16th of February, he was created Duke of Somerset, one of the highest titles in the English peerage. He was also appointed Lord High Treasurer, giving him control of the kingdom's finances. In the space of a few weeks, the man from Wolf Hall had become the uncrowned King of England, the most powerful commoner in the land, ruling in the name of his nephew, the boy king, with an authority that was, in practice, almost indistinguishable from that of the monarch himself. Somerset's first great act as Lord Protector was to continue the war with Scotland that Henry VIII had begun. The stated aim of the war was to force the Scots to agree to the marriage of young Mary, Queen of Scots, to Edward VI, a marriage that would, in time, unite the two kingdoms under a single crown. But the Scots, backed by their old ally France, had steadfastly refused to agree, and the years of raiding and burning that Henry had unleashed upon them, the rough wooing, as it was called, had only hardened their resistance. In September 1547, Somerset decided to settle the matter by force. He gathered an army of approximately 18,000 men at Berwick on the Scottish border and marched northward along the east coast, supported by a fleet of 30 warships that sailed alongside the army, keeping it supplied and providing heavy firepower from the sea. The Scots, under the Earl of Arran, who was acting as regent for the young Queen Mary, mustered a larger force, perhaps 22,000 men, and positioned themselves on the western bank of the River Esk, near the town of Musselburgh, blocking Somerset's advance on Edinburgh. The Battle of Pinkie, fought on the 10th of September 1547, was the last great pitched battle between the armies of England and Scotland. It was also one of the bloodiest, and it is regarded by military historians as the first modern battle fought on British soil, a battle in which artillery, cavalry, infantry, and naval gunfire were coordinated in a way that had never been seen before in the wars between the two kingdoms. The battle began well for the Scots, who drove back an initial English cavalry charge with their dense formations of pikemen, long hedgehogs of men armed with 18-foot pikes who had been the terror of European battlefields for a century. The Scottish cavalry also performed well in the early stages, repelling the English horse and maintaining the integrity of their line. For a brief time it seemed as though the Scots might carry the day. But the English artillery, both the 15 land-based guns that Somerset had brought north and the heavy cannons aboard the warships in the Firth of Forth, proved devastating. The ships in particular were able to pour fire into the flank of the Scottish formation from a position where the Scots could not reply, and the effect was catastrophic. Great gaps were torn in the Scottish ranks. Formations that had held firm under cavalry charges began to waver and break under the relentless bombardment. And when the Scots attempted to advance across the river to close with the English infantry, they were caught in a murderous crossfire of artillery, arrows, and musket fire from Spanish and German mercenaries in Somerset's army. Professional soldiers armed with early firearms called arquebuses, who poured volley after volley into the dense mass of Scottish pikemen. The Scottish formation broke, and what had been a battle became a slaughter. The fleeing Scots were cut down in their thousands by English cavalry as they tried to escape across the flat ground between the river and the hills. Bodies were piled so thick in some places that the pursuing horsemen could barely ride through them. And the day became known in Scotland as Black Saturday, a name that would echo through Scottish memory for centuries. The casualties were staggering. Estimates of Scottish dead range from 6,000 to as many as 15,000 men, compared to perhaps 500 English killed. Among the Scottish dead were monks and clergymen from various religious orders who had marched with the army, a reminder that this was, in part, a religious war as well as a dynastic one. It was a comprehensive military victory, and Somerset returned to London as a conquering hero, the man who had humbled Scotland and brought glory to English arms. But Pinkie, for all its spectacular violence, was ultimately a hollow victory. Somerset lacked the resources to garrison the Scottish lowlands permanently, and the French, who had no intention of allowing Scotland to fall into England's orbit, responded to the defeat by sending troops and ships to Scotland and arranging for the young Queen Mary to be taken to France, where she would eventually marry the French Dauphin. The marriage that Somerset had fought so hard to secure between Edward and Mary would never take place. The rough wooing had failed, and the enormous cost of the war would contribute directly to the financial and political crises that would eventually bring Somerset down. For now, however, the Lord Protector was at the height of his power. He had won a great battle. He held all the levers of government in his hands, and he began to use that power to pursue a program of reform that was, by the standards of the time, remarkably ambitious and remarkably reckless. Somerset was a committed Protestant, and under his protectorate the English Reformation advanced rapidly. The first Book of Common Prayer was introduced, requiring all church services to be conducted in English rather than Latin. The chantries, small chapels endowed by wealthy individuals for priests to say masses for the dead, were dissolved and their revenues seized by the crown. Images and stained glass windows were removed from churches. The old Catholic rituals were suppressed, replaced by a simpler, more austere form of worship that owed much to the theology of the continental reformers. At the same time, Somerset attempted something even more ambitious, a program of social reform designed to address the grievances of the common people. Across England, wealthy landowners had been enclosing common land, that is, fencing off fields that had traditionally been used by the whole community, and converting them into private pasture for sheep. The wool trade was booming, and the profits from sheep farming were enormous. But the enclosures had caused widespread hardship among the rural poor, who depended on the common land for grazing, for fuel, and for the basic materials of everyday life. Families that had used the same fields for generations found themselves suddenly without access to the land they needed to survive. Villages were emptied, ploughland was turned to pasture, and the men and women who had once tilled the soil were turned out to wander the roads, looking for work that did not exist and food that they could not afford. Somerset, who was sympathetic to the plight of the poor, and who perhaps saw himself as a champion of the common people against the predations of the landowning class, issued a series of proclamations forbidding further enclosures and establishing commissions to investigate and reverse those that had already taken place. He appointed John Hales, a reformer who shared his views, to lead the investigation, and Hales set about his work with an energy and a thoroughness that alarmed the very men who sat beside Somerset on the Privy Council. The landowners of England, the men who controlled the shires, who sat in Parliament, who commanded the local militias, and who formed the backbone of Tudor government, were being told that their property rights were subject to review, and they did not like it. It was well-intentioned policy, but it was also catastrophically misjudged. Somerset's anti-enclosure proclamations raised expectations among the common people without providing the means to fulfill them. The landowners who controlled the Privy Council were furious. The proclamations threatened their interests, their wealth, and their way of life, and they had no intention of obeying them. One of Somerset's own close friends and allies, Sir William Paget, who had been instrumental in helping him secure the Protectorate, warned him repeatedly that his policies were alienating the very men whose support he needed to govern. Somerset, in his certainty that he was doing the right thing, chose to ignore the warnings. Meanwhile, the common people, encouraged by Somerset's rhetoric and by the language of his proclamations, which seemed to promise that the Lord Protector would take their side against their oppressors, took matters into their own hands. In the summer of 1549, a series of rebellions broke out across England, the most serious of which were the Prayer Book Rebellion in the southwest, where Catholic communities rose in violent protest against the new Protestant liturgy that had been imposed upon them, and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, where a large force of peasants and yeomen, led by a tanner named Robert Kett, occupied the city of Norwich and demanded the end of enclosures and the restoration of their ancient rights. Somerset's response to the rebellions was muddled and indecisive. He sympathised with the rebels' grievances, or at least claimed to, and he was reluctant to use the kind of brutal military force that his colleagues on the council demanded. The task of suppressing the Norfolk rebellion fell instead to John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, a hard, decisive, politically astute soldier who had none of Somerset's sentimental attachment to the common people. Warwick crushed the rebels at the Battle of Dussindale on the 27th of August 1549, killing 3,000 Norfolk farm boys and labourers, with an army of professional soldiers and German mercenaries. The contrast between Somerset's dithering and Warwick's efficiency was not lost on the council, and as the summer of 1549 turned to autumn, the men around the king began to ask themselves whether the Lord Protector was really the right man to be governing England. While Edward Seymour was wrestling with the burdens of governing England, his younger brother Thomas was busy making a spectacular mess of everything he touched. Thomas Seymour was, by all accounts, an extraordinarily attractive man. Tall, handsome, charming, and possessed of a confidence that bordered on recklessness. He was also, by the standards of the Tudor court, dangerously ambitious, with a sense of his own importance that far outstripped his abilities. He had served Henry VIII in minor diplomatic and military capacities. embassies abroad, a command of the Channel Fleet, and he had performed these duties competently enough. But Thomas's real talent was not for statecraft or for war. It was for self-promotion, for intrigue, and for the relentless pursuit of his own advancement at the expense of everyone around him, including his own brother. When Edward VI came to the throne in January 1547, Thomas Seymour was among those who benefited from the general distribution of honours that accompanied the new reign. He was created Baron Seymour of Sudeley and appointed Lord High Admiral of England, a position that gave him command of the English Navy and a seat on the Privy Council. These were considerable distinctions for a man of Thomas's background, and most men in his position would have been content with them. But Thomas was not most men. He looked at his brother's position, Lord Protector, Duke of Somerset, ruler of England in all but name, and he saw not a family triumph to be celebrated, but a personal affront to be remedied. The rivalry between the two brothers had been simmering for years, but it burst into the open almost immediately after Henry's death. Thomas believed that the protectorate should have been shared between the two of them, or, at the very least, that he should have been given a more prominent role in the government. He resented his brother's monopoly on power, and he was determined to find a way to challenge it. His first move was audacious. Within weeks of Henry VIII's death, so quickly that it scandalized the court, Thomas began courting Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen. Catherine was Henry's sixth and final wife, a woman of intelligence, piety, and considerable personal wealth, who had nursed the aging king through his final years, and who had, by all accounts, been a kind and devoted stepmother to all three of Henry's children. She was also a woman with a past. Before her marriage to Henry, she had been in love with Thomas Seymour, and it was only the king's intervention that had prevented them from marrying. Now, with Henry dead, Thomas wasted no time in rekindling the relationship. They were married in secret, probably in April or May of 1547, barely 4 months after the king's death. The marriage was controversial. Custom and propriety demanded a longer period of mourning, and it infuriated Somerset, who saw it as a challenge to his authority and a potential source of political embarrassment. Catherine Parr was, after all, the Queen Dowager, the stepmother of the king, and her marriage to a man who was already jockeying for power at court raised uncomfortable questions about Thomas's ultimate intentions. William Cecil, who was then a young secretary in Somerset's service and who would one day become the most powerful minister in Elizabethan England, wrote of the affair with barely concealed dismay, noting that Catherine was known to be big with child, and that the secrecy of the marriage had made a difficult situation even worse. The marriage also deepened the rift between the two Seymour brothers, because it placed Thomas in an awkward position relative to Somerset's authority. As the husband of the Queen Dowager, Thomas could claim a status and a dignity that threatened to rival the Lord Protector's own. And Somerset's wife, the formidable Anne Stanhope, was not the kind of woman to suffer a rival gladly. The marriage brought Thomas into the orbit of two other figures who would play crucial roles in his downfall. The first was the Princess Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn, and the future Elizabeth I, who was living in Catherine Parr's household at the time of the marriage. Elizabeth was 14 years old, intelligent, and already possessed of the political instincts that would later make her one of the greatest rulers in English history. She was also, in a very real sense, vulnerable. A teenage girl living in the household of a man who was not her father, with no parent to protect her, and no established position at court. What happened between Thomas Seymour and Elizabeth is one of the most troubling episodes in Tudor history. The sources describe a pattern of behaviour that can only be described as deeply inappropriate. Thomas would enter Elizabeth's bedchamber in the mornings while she was still in bed, tickle her, slap her playfully, and engage in what the shocked members of her household described as romping and rough play. On one occasion, Catherine Parr herself joined in, holding Elizabeth while Thomas cut her gown into pieces with a pair of shears. On another, Catherine found Thomas and Elizabeth embracing, and was, understandably, appalled. Catherine sent Elizabeth away from the household, a decision that probably saved Elizabeth's reputation and possibly her life. But the damage had been done. Thomas's behaviour had compromised a princess of the blood, and the whispers that circulated through the court would follow both of them for years. The second figure drawn into Thomas's orbit was the young king himself. Thomas, who had been appointed governor of the king's person, or rather, who had unsuccessfully sought the appointment, which was given instead to Anne Stanhope's brother, Sir Michael Stanhope, made it his business to cultivate a personal relationship with his nephew. He gave Edward pocket money, spoke to him privately, and attempted to position himself as a rival authority to the Lord Protector. It was a dangerous game, and Thomas played it with all the subtlety of a man juggling live grenades. Meanwhile, the relationship between Thomas and his brother was being poisoned by a separate quarrel, one that involved their wives. Anne Stanhope, the Duchess of Somerset, was a proud and formidable woman who considered herself, as the wife of the Lord Protector, to be the first lady of the realm. Catherine Parr, who was the Queen Dowager and who therefore technically outranked the Duchess, did not agree. The dispute over precedence, who would walk first in processions, who would sit in the place of honour at banquets, who would be treated as the senior woman at court, became a running sore that infected every aspect of the relationship between the two Seymour households. The quarrel centred, in part, on a set of jewels that had belonged to the Queens of England, and that Somerset had taken into the treasury on the grounds that they were state property, and could not be kept by a Queen Dowager. Catherine Parr wanted them back. Anne Stanhope, who reportedly wanted to wear them herself, did not want to give them up. The Duchess was quoted as having said, or, according to a later source, as having thought, that if the Lord Admiral could not teach his wife better manners, she was the woman who would. Catherine, in private, referred to her sister-in-law as that hell. Whether Anne ever physically pushed Catherine from her place at the head of court processions, as some sources claim, is debated by historians. The story rests on accounts written more than a century after the fact. But the bitterness of the feud is not in doubt. Catherine Parr's death brought no peace. She died on the 5th of September 1548 at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire of puerperal fever, just 6 days after giving birth to a daughter named Mary. In her final hours, delirious with fever, Catherine is reported to have lashed out at Thomas, saying that she had not been well handled. A cryptic remark that some have interpreted as a reference to his behaviour with Elizabeth, and others as the confused utterance of a dying woman. Whatever she meant, the words have echoed through the centuries as a final, ambiguous judgment on the man she had married. The funeral was conducted in the chapel at Sudeley Castle, and it was notable for being the first Protestant funeral in England, Scotland or Ireland to be conducted entirely in English rather than in Latin. The chief mourner was Lady Jane Grey, who was living in the Parr Seymour household at the time and who would, 5 years later, become Queen of England for 9 brief and terrible days. Catherine was buried in the castle chapel, and there she remained, largely forgotten, until her tomb was rediscovered in the 18th century. The baby, Mary Seymour, was healthy, but she was now motherless. And her father, Thomas, freed from the restraining influence of his wife, was about to embark on the final, most reckless chapter of his career. With Catherine dead, Thomas's behaviour became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He seemed to lose whatever remnants of caution he had once possessed. He made approaches to both the Princess Elizabeth and the Princess Mary, apparently hoping to marry one of them and thereby strengthen his claim to influence over the crown. He used his position as Lord Admiral to make illegal but profitable deals with the pirates who plagued the English Channel, taking a share of their plunder in exchange for turning a blind eye to their activities. He attempted to build an independent power base, stockpiling weapons and money at his estates and cultivating relationships with disaffected nobles who shared his resentment of Somerset's monopoly on power. And he continued to cultivate his relationship with the young king, pressing Edward for pocket money and whispering against the Lord Protector at every opportunity. Each of these actions, taken individually, might have been dismissed as the behaviour of a foolish and ambitious man. Taken together, they painted a picture of a man who was planning something far more dangerous. The climax came on the night of the 16th of January, 1549. Thomas Seymour, armed with a pistol, broke into the king's private apartments at Hampton Court Palace. What he intended to do, whether he meant to kidnap the king, to speak with him privately, or simply to make some kind of dramatic gesture, has never been satisfactorily explained. What actually happened was that the king's pet spaniel, which slept outside his bedchamber, barked at the intruder, and Thomas shot the dog dead. The noise roused the guards, and Thomas was arrested. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Thomas's scheming. The Privy Council, determined to root out every detail of the Lord Admiral's intrigues, launched a methodical and thorough inquiry that touched every corner of his life. His servants were questioned. His financial dealings were examined. His correspondence was seized and scrutinized. And the testimony that emerged painted a picture of a man who had been systematically building a network of influence, money, and military resources with the clear intention of challenging his brother's authority, and possibly of seizing power for himself. The most delicate part of the investigation concerned the Princess Elizabeth. She was interrogated at Hatfield House by Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, a stern and experienced counsellor who had been sent by the Privy Council to extract the truth about her relationship with Thomas Seymour. Elizabeth's servants, Thomas Parry, her cofferer, and Catherine Ashley, her beloved governess, were arrested and taken to the Tower, where they were questioned separately and at length. Under pressure, both servants revealed the details of Thomas's inappropriate behaviour in Catherine Parr's household. The morning visits to Elizabeth's bedchamber, the tickling, the romping, the incident with the shears, the embrace that Catherine had walked in upon. Elizabeth herself, however, proved to be an extraordinarily difficult witness. She was 15 years old, frightened, and entirely alone, without parents, without protectors, and without anyone at court who could shield her from the consequences of whatever she might say. And yet, she handled herself with a composure and a political intelligence that astonished her interrogators. She admitted nothing that was not already known. She denied anything that could not be proven. She wept when it seemed useful to weep, and she stood firm when it seemed necessary to stand firm. And she gave away nothing at all, that could have been used to connect her to Thomas Seymour's schemes or to compromise her honour. Tyrwhitt, frustrated by his inability to break her, wrote to the council that he believed Elizabeth had been coached by Ashley, which was probably true, and that he could not get a full confession from her without stronger measures, which the council wisely declined to authorise. Elizabeth emerged from the investigation with her reputation battered but intact, and the terrifying experience of being interrogated by agents of the state, of knowing that a careless word could mean disgrace or death, would shape her political instincts for the rest of her life. She had learned at 15 the most important lesson that Tudor England had to teach. Trust no one, say nothing, and never let them see you bleed. And on the basis of the evidence gathered, Thomas was charged with 33 counts of treason. There was no trial. The evidence, while damning in its accumulation, was not strong enough to secure a conviction before a jury, and so Thomas was condemned instead by an Act of Attainder. a parliamentary decree that declared him guilty without the need for a judicial proceeding. Somerset, as Lord Protector, should have signed the death warrant, but he could not bring himself to do it. The warrant was signed instead by the young King Edward himself. Thomas Seymour was executed on Tower Hill on the 20th of March, 1549. He was approximately 40 years old. The Princess Elizabeth, on hearing the news, is said to have remarked, with the cool detachment that would become her hallmark, that he was a man of much wit and very little judgment. It was perhaps the most accurate epitaph he could have been given. The baby Mary Seymour, orphaned at 7 months, was placed in the care of Catherine Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk, who had been one of Catherine Parr's closest friends. The Privy Council allocated funds for her upkeep, but within a year or two, the little girl had vanished from the historical record entirely. She never claimed her inheritance. She never appeared at court. She simply disappeared. A small, quiet tragedy at the end of a loud and violent story. The most likely explanation, supported by a Latin epitaph written by Catherine Parr's former chaplain, is that she died in infancy or early childhood. But her fate has never been confirmed, and her disappearance remains one of the enduring mysteries of Tudor history. The execution of Thomas Seymour solved one of Somerset's problems, but created several more. The Lord Protector had been forced to choose between his brother and his duty, and the choice had cost him dearly. In reputation, in political capital, and in the private anguish that even the most ambitious men must feel when they sign away a brother's life. Those who had always distrusted Somerset now had fresh ammunition. Here was a man who would execute his own flesh and blood to preserve his power, and those who had supported him began to wonder whether a ruler who could do such a thing was the kind of ruler they wanted. The greater problem, however, was not Thomas's execution, but the mess that Thomas's execution left behind. The investigations into Thomas's conduct had revealed uncomfortable truths about the Lord Protector's own household. The jewels dispute with Catherine Parr, the extravagant lifestyle of the Duchess of Somerset, the perception that the Protector was enriching himself at the Crown's expense. Somerset had built himself a great London residence, Somerset House, partly with stones stripped from the demolished churches and cloisters of old London, including the Priory of St. John of Jerusalem and the cloister of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was an act that had scandalized many, even in an age when the destruction of religious houses was commonplace, and it seemed to confirm the charge that the Protector, for all his talk of helping the poor and championing the common people, was just as rapacious and self-serving as the men he publicly condemned. The construction of Somerset House became, in the eyes of his enemies, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the Protectorate. Here was a man who issued proclamations against the enclosure of common land, while simultaneously tearing down churches to build himself a palace. Here was a man who claimed to speak for the poor, while living in a style that rivaled the king himself. The hypocrisy was obvious, and it was damaging because it gave Somerset's enemies on the council, men who had their own reasons for wanting him removed, a powerful tool with which to undermine his authority and his reputation. And the problems kept mounting. The costly war with Scotland had drained the treasury without achieving its objectives. The enclosure commissions had angered the landed classes without satisfying the poor. Inflation was rising. The coinage had been debased. A policy begun under Henry VIII, but continued under Somerset, and the purchasing power of ordinary people was falling. The religious reforms had divided the country, with Catholic communities in the west and Protestant radicals in the east, both feeling that the government was moving too far or not far enough. The summer of 1549 brought these tensions to a head. The Prayer Book Rebellion in Devon and Cornwall, a Catholic uprising against the new English language liturgy, and Kett's Rebellion in Norfolk, A popular rising against enclosures and economic grievances erupted simultaneously, stretching the government's military resources to breaking point. Somerset's response was, as we have seen, muddled and indecisive. He sympathised with the Norfolk rebels' demands but could not satisfy them. He was reluctant to use military force against his own people, but could not restore order without it. And when John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, stepped in to crush the Norfolk rebellion with brutal efficiency, the contrast between the two men's styles of leadership was painfully clear. By October 1549, the members of the Privy Council had had enough. Somerset, sensing that the political ground was shifting beneath him, made a desperate move. He took the young King Edward from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle, ostensibly for the king's safety, but in reality as a hostage against the council's growing opposition. It was a move that recalled the reckless behaviour of his dead brother, and it had much the same effect. The council moved against him. On the 11th of October 1549, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, was arrested and brought before the king he had ruled in the name of. Edward VI, still only 12 years old, summarised the charges against his uncle with a clarity and a coolness that are, in their way, as chilling as anything in Tudor history. The charges the king recorded in his diary were ambition, vainglory, entering into rash wars in his youth, negligent looking on New Haven, enriching himself of the king's treasure, following his own opinion, and doing all by his own authority. It was a devastating indictment, and it came from the mouth of a child. Somerset was stripped of the protectorate, removed from the council, and sent to the Tower of London. The man who replaced him as the dominant figure in the council was John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, the soldier who had crushed Kett's rebellion, and who was, in every respect, Somerset's opposite. Where Somerset had been idealistic and politically inept, Dudley was pragmatic, calculating, and ruthlessly efficient. Where Somerset had alienated his colleagues by ignoring their advice and acting on his own authority, Dudley understood the importance of consensus and coalition building. He knew that power in Tudor England was not something one man could hold alone, but something that had to be shared, managed, and constantly negotiated. Where Somerset had tried to help the poor and had succeeded only in provoking rebellion, Dudley focused on restoring order and maintaining the support of the propertied classes who actually controlled the machinery of government. Dudley was also, it must be said, a more ruthless man than Somerset. He had none of Somerset's scruples, none of his sentimentality, and none of his attachment to abstract principles of justice and fairness. He was a soldier and a politician, a man who understood that power was a practical matter, a question of alliances, resources, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment demanded it. He would later earn the unflattering nickname the Great Survivor for his ability to navigate the lethal politics of the Tudor court, and the nickname was well deserved. He was a man who understood how power worked, and he was not afraid to use it. Under Dudley's leadership, he was raised to the dukedom of Northumberland in October 1551. The government of England became more efficient, more centralised, and more brutal. The anti-enclosure commissions that Somerset had established were quietly disbanded. The religious reforms continued, but they were driven by political calculation rather than by conviction. The debased coinage was reformed, and the Crown's finances were stabilised. And the men who had challenged Dudley's authority, or who might in the future challenge it, were carefully and methodically removed. For a time it seemed as though Somerset might survive. Dudley needed allies against the Catholic faction on the council, and Somerset was a useful counterweight. In February 1550, the former protector was released from the Tower. He was pardoned by the king in the same month and restored to the Privy Council in April. He was even superficially reconciled with Dudley, and the two men sealed their apparent friendship with a marriage between their children. Dudley's son married Somerset's daughter, a union that was intended to signal that the old rivalry was over and that the two great men of the kingdom were working together for the common good. But the reconciliation was a fiction, and both men knew it. Somerset had tasted supreme power, and he could not accept the diminished role that Dudley had assigned him. He began to plot, or, at the very least, to talk about plotting, and the rumours that circulated through the court were enough to give Dudley the pretext he needed to act. The charges against Somerset, when they came, were lurid and almost certainly exaggerated. It was alleged that he had planned a banquet massacre, an event at which the members of the council would be invited to dine and then assaulted and killed, with Dudley himself as the primary target. Somerset later admitted to having contemplated Dudley's arrest and execution, which was damaging enough, even if the wilder allegations of planned mass murder were probably fabricated. The testimony of Sir Thomas Palmer, a courtier who would himself be executed the following year for his support of Lady Jane Grey, was crucial to the prosecution's case, but its reliability is deeply suspect. Somerset was arrested for the second time on the 11th of October, 1551, exactly 2 years to the day after his first arrest. He was taken from his home and conveyed to the Tower of London under guard, passing through streets that he had once ridden through as the most powerful man in England. The trial took place in December, before the House of Lords, in a proceeding that was as much a political theatre as it was a judicial event. The charges were grave: treason, conspiracy to murder, plotting to overthrow the government. But the evidence was thin, and the lords who sat in judgment knew it. Somerset defended himself with dignity, answering the charges calmly and methodically, and the peers were sufficiently unconvinced by the treason charges to acquit him on that count. When the acquittal was announced, the crowd of onlookers who had gathered outside erupted in cheers so loud that they could be heard inside the hall, a spontaneous expression of the affection that the common people still felt for the man who had tried, however clumsily, to champion their cause. But the cheers were premature. Somerset was convicted of the lesser charge of felony, assembling men with the intent to create a riot, a charge that still carried the death penalty, and everyone in the courtroom understood that the real purpose of the trial had been not to discover the truth, but to provide a legal framework for Somerset's removal. Dudley wanted him dead, and the machinery of the law would provide the means. The weeks between the trial and the execution were filled with rumours and anxieties. Londoners who had cheered Somerset's acquittal on the treason charge grumbled openly about the injustice of the verdict. There were whispers that a rescue attempt might be mounted, that the common people might rise up to save their champion. The council, nervous and watchful, moved the execution date forward to forestall any such attempt. On the 22nd of January 1552, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, was led out onto the scaffold on Tower Hill. It was a cold winter morning, and a large crowd had gathered, far larger than was usual for such occasions, a testament to the hold that Somerset still had on the popular imagination. These were not courtiers or politicians. They were ordinary Londoners, apprentices, tradesmen, servants, labourers, the very people for whom Somerset had claimed to speak, and many of them had come not to gawk, but to grieve. As Somerset prepared to address the crowd, a sudden commotion erupted. The precise cause was never determined. Some accounts speak of a troop of horsemen arriving unexpectedly, others of a rumour sweeping through the crowd that a pardon had been granted. But the effect was pandemonium. Some people stumbled and fell into the ditch that surrounded the scaffold. Others ran toward nearby houses, pushing and shoving in their panic. For a few terrifying moments it seemed as though the crowd might rush the scaffold itself. But the disorder subsided as quickly as it had begun, and Somerset, calm and composed amid the chaos, raised his hand for silence. He spoke briefly and with great composure. He acknowledged that he had been justly condemned by the law. He asked forgiveness of all those he had offended. He expressed his hope that the young king would reign long and well, and he commended his soul to God. Then he knelt, laid his head upon the block, and the axe fell. The man who had ruled England was dead. His body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the walls of the Tower of London, the same chapel where Anne Boleyn lay, and where Thomas Cromwell lay, and where so many others who had reached too high and fallen too far would be laid to rest. It was a place of silence and of shadows, far removed from the great halls and sunlit gardens, where Somerset had once held court as the uncrowned king of England. Edward VI, who was 14 years old, recorded the execution in his diary with the same cool detachment he had shown throughout his uncle's downfall. There is no evidence that the boy king felt any grief or any guilt. He appeared, in the words of one historian, to have been perfectly convinced of his uncle's guilt, and in that conviction to have given himself no further concern about the Duke. Anne Stanhope, the Duchess, the proud, fierce, formidable woman who had been the first lady of the realm and who had quarrelled with queens, survived her husband by 35 years. She was imprisoned in the Tower for a time after Somerset's fall, but she was eventually released, and she lived on quietly and in relative obscurity until her death in 1587. She had outlasted everyone, her husband, her enemies, the king she had served, and the queen she had quarrelled with. With both Seymour brothers dead, the family's hold on power depended entirely on the life of one boy. King Edward VI, the son of Jane Seymour, the nephew of the executed Duke of Somerset and the executed Baron Seymour of Sudeley. Edward was the last link between the Seymour family and the throne, and if he lived long enough to rule in his own right, to marry, and to produce an heir, the Seymour blood would flow through the veins of English kings for generations to come. Edward was, by all accounts, an extraordinary child. He had been given the finest education that Tudor England could provide, tutored by scholars such as John Check, Richard Cox, Roger Ascham, and Jean Belman, men who were among the leading intellectuals of their generation and who saw in the young king an opportunity to shape the mind of a monarch in the image of the Protestant Reformation. By the age of 6, Edward was studying French, Spanish, Italian, and geometry, and playing musical instruments with considerable skill. By the age of 12, he was undertaking serious work on religious questions, engaging with the theological controversies of his time with an intensity and a sophistication that astonished his tutors. By 13, he had written a treatise arguing that the Pope was the Antichrist, a work of youthful zeal that reflected not only his own convictions, but the influence of the Protestant scholars who had shaped his education. Edward was, in temperament, nothing like his mother. Where Jane had been quiet and passive, Edward was assertive and opinionated. Where Jane had deferred to the men around her, Edward insisted on his own authority, even as a child, and recorded the events of his reign in a diary that reveals a mind of considerable clarity and detachment. He was a boy who took his responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously, and who viewed the world through the rigid lens of his Protestant faith. Under Edward's reign, or rather under the reigns of the men who governed in his name, the English Reformation advanced to its furthest point yet. The first Book of Common Prayer, introduced in 1549 under Somerset's protectorate, was replaced in 1552 by a second, even more radical edition that stripped away the last vestiges of Catholic ritual and established a form of worship that was recognizably Protestant in every particular. The old altars were removed from churches and replaced with plain wooden tables. The elaborate vestments of the Catholic priesthood were abolished. The Mass, the central sacrament of the old religion, was replaced by a communion service conducted in English. And the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of the Eucharist were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ, was officially rejected. These were sweeping changes, and they affected the daily lives of every man, woman, and child in England. For those who embraced the new religion, they were a liberation, a stripping away of centuries of superstition and idolatry in favor of a purer, more direct relationship with God. For those who clung to the old faith, they were an abomination, a willful destruction of everything that had given meaning and beauty to the religious life of the nation. The tensions that these reforms created would not be resolved in Edward's lifetime or in the lifetimes of his successors, and the scars they left on English society can still be traced today. He was also, by 1553, dying. Edward's health had never been robust. He had suffered from fevers and illnesses throughout his childhood, and in the early months of 1553, he developed a cough and a shortness of breath that grew steadily worse. He had caught measles earlier in the year, and it is now believed that the measles suppressed his natural immunity and allowed him to contract tuberculosis, the disease that would kill him. By the spring, he was visibly wasting away, his body racked by pain and his lungs filling with fluid. By June, he was unable to keep food down, and the doctors who attended him knew that there was nothing more they could do. As he lay dying, Edward was consumed by a single, overwhelming fear that his death would undo everything he had worked for. He had spent his short reign advancing the Protestant Reformation in England, and he knew that if the crown passed to his half-sister Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic, everything he had built would be swept away. The Book of Common Prayer, the Reformed liturgy, the dissolution of the chantries, the suppression of the old Catholic rituals. All of it would be reversed, and England would return to the old faith. To prevent this, Edward made one of the most controversial decisions in Tudor history. He drew up a document called the Device for the Succession, which altered the line of succession established by his father's will and by Act of Parliament. The device passed over both of his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and named instead his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. Jane was the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary, and she was a Protestant, the ideal choice in Edward's eyes to safeguard the Reformation after his death. The device was almost certainly written at the instigation of John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, who had arranged for his own son, Guildford Dudley, to marry Lady Jane Grey. If Jane became queen, Dudley would control the throne through his daughter-in-law. It was a bold gamble, and it would fail spectacularly. But that is a story for another time. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. In his final hours, he was racked by pain so severe that he confided to an attendant that he was glad to die. His body had wasted away to almost nothing. The brilliant, earnest boy who had once mastered 6 languages and debated theology with bishops was now a skeletal figure, barely able to speak, coughing up blood and struggling for every breath. To his last moment, he tried to safeguard the Protestant religion that had been the consuming passion of his short life. His last words, whispered to a servant who cradled him in his arms as the life drained from his body, were, "Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." He died between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening, and his death was kept secret for 2 days, while Dudley manoeuvred to secure the throne for Lady Jane Grey. On the 19th of July, Mary was proclaimed queen amid great rejoicing in the streets of London. The people had never accepted the device for the succession, and had no love for Dudley's transparent power grab. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 days queen, was arrested, and Dudley himself was executed for treason the following month. Mary, the devout Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, wasted no time in dismantling every Protestant reform that her brother had put in place. The Book of Common Prayer was abolished. The Mass was restored. England returned to Rome. Edward was buried on the 8th of August at Westminster Abbey, in the Lady Chapel built by his grandfather, Henry VII. He was laid to rest, without the Catholic ceremony that his sister Mary would later restore to the Church. A final, poignant symbol of the faith he had lived and died for. With Edward's death, the Seymour moment was over. The family had been granted a single generation of extraordinary power. A generation that had lasted from Jane's marriage to the king in 1536 to Edward's death in 1553 for just 17 years. In that time they had produced a queen, a king, a Lord Protector and a Lord Admiral. They had won battles, reformed the church, and governed a kingdom, and they had lost almost everything. Jane was dead. Her son was dead. Her eldest brother was dead. Her younger brother was dead. Catherine Parr, who had married into the family and who had borne its last, most tragic child, was dead. And that child, Mary Seymour, had vanished from the face of the earth. Mary Seymour was born on the 30th of August 1548 at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. She was the only child of Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr, a baby born into privilege and power who, within 7 months of her birth, was an orphan. Her mother died of puerperal fever 6 days after giving birth. Her father was executed for treason the following March. The baby was initially placed at Sion House with her uncle Somerset and his wife Anne Stanhope. But after Thomas's death sentence, his final request was for his daughter to be raised by the Duchess of Suffolk, Catherine Willoughby, who had been one of Catherine Parr's closest friends. The Privy Council granted funds for the child's upkeep, but the grants were small, and the Duchess of Suffolk, who was supporting an expensive household of her own, struggled to maintain the establishment that was expected for the daughter of a queen. We hear of Mary once more in a grant from the Privy Council for household wages and food in early 1550. And then, silence. Mary Seymour disappears from the historical record entirely. She was approximately 18 months old. What happened to her? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain. The most widely accepted theory, and the most likely, is that she died in infancy, probably at Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire, where the Duchess of Suffolk had her country home. Infant mortality was common in the 16th century, and there was nothing unusual in a statistical sense about a child dying before the age of 2. A Latin epitaph written by John Parkhurst, who had served as Catherine Parr's chaplain, and published in a book of poems in 1573, appears to mourn a child of royal descent who died young. And many scholars believe that this epitaph refers to Mary Seymour. The poem reads, in translation, "I, whom at the cost of her own life my queenly mother bore with the pangs of labour, sleep under this marble, an unfit traveller." An unfit traveller, a child who came into the world, stayed briefly, and departed without leaving a trace. It is one of the saddest phrases in Tudor history, and one of the most fitting epitaphs for the family that burned so brightly and then vanished just as quickly. Some Victorian historians, notably Agnes Strickland, claimed that Mary survived to adulthood and married a man named Sir Edward Bushell, but this theory is unsupported by credible evidence. Modern historians treat it with extreme caution. The most likely truth is the simplest and the saddest. Mary Seymour died as a child, and with her death, the last ember of the Seymour Golden Age flickered and went out. But the Seymour family did not end with Edward VI's death, or with Mary Seymour's quiet disappearance. The bloodline endured, diminished, humbled, stripped of its titles and much of its land, but alive. And in the decades that followed the fall of the Lord Protector, a new generation of Seymours would attempt, again and again, to recover the greatness that their parents had lost. Their methods were remarkably consistent and remarkably unfortunate. They married in secret, and they ended up in the Tower. The man who carried the Seymour name into the second half of the 16th century was Edward Seymour, the eldest surviving son of the Duke of Somerset by his second marriage to Anne Stanhope. Born around 1539, young Edward had been a child of 9 or 10 when his father was first stripped of the protectorate, and a boy of 12 or 13 when his father was led to the scaffold. The family's property had been confiscated, its titles forfeited, and its reputation ruined. But the Seymours were not without resources. They still had their blood, their connections, and the memory of their former grandeur. And under the reign of Mary I, the attainder that had been passed on the Duke of Somerset was partially reversed, restoring the family to a measure of respectability. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in November 1558, young Edward Seymour was among those who benefited from the new Queen's desire to reward loyal Protestants and to surround herself with men of good birth and sound character. In January 1559, he was created Baron Beauchamp and Earl of Hertford, a revival of 2 of the titles that his father had held. And for a time it seemed as though the Seymours were on the road to recovery. And then Edward fell in love. The woman who captured the Earl of Hertford's heart was Lady Catherine Grey, the younger sister of the ill-fated Lady Jane Grey, who had been Queen of England for 9 days in 1553 before being deposed and executed by Mary Tudor. Catherine Grey was not merely an attractive and well-connected young woman. She was, in the eyes of many Protestants, the rightful heir to the English throne. Under the terms of Henry VIII's will, Catherine stood next in the line of succession after Queen Elizabeth herself, ahead of Mary, Queen of Scots, whose claim to the throne came through a different branch of the Tudor family tree. If Elizabeth died without issue, and as the years passed and the Queen showed no inclination to marry, this began to seem increasingly likely. Catherine Grey might well become the next Queen of England. It was precisely this dynastic significance that made Catherine Grey's marriage such a dangerous proposition. A law had been passed, the Royal Marriages Act, which made it a criminal offence for anyone with a claim to the throne to marry without the sovereign's consent. Elizabeth, who was acutely sensitive to any challenge to her authority and who regarded the whole question of the succession as a personal affront, would never have consented to a marriage between Catherine Grey and any man, least of all a Seymour, whose family had already demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion possible what happened when ambitious men married into the royal line. But Edward Seymour and Catherine Grey married anyway. The ceremony took place in secret, probably in November or December of 1560, at Hertford's London house in Cannon Row, Westminster. The only witness was Lady Jane Seymour, Edward's sister, the daughter of the Duke of Somerset, who was one of Catherine's closest friends. The ceremony was conducted by an anonymous clergyman whose identity was never established, and in the months that followed, the couple kept their marriage secret from everyone at court. The secret held for nearly a year. But in August 1561, when Catherine was 8 months pregnant and could no longer conceal her condition, she was forced to confess. The consequences were immediate and severe. Elizabeth was furious. Both Catherine and Edward were arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Catherine was confined immediately. Edward, who was abroad on a tour of the continent at the time, was recalled and imprisoned upon his return. Catherine gave birth to a son, Edward, styled Lord Beauchamp, on the 21st of September 1561 in the Tower of London. The baby was born into a prison, the son of parents who were being punished for the crime of loving each other without permission. Queen Elizabeth refused to acknowledge the marriage. She appointed a commission headed by the Archbishop of Canterbury to investigate the union, and in May 1562, the commission duly declared that the marriage was invalid, on the grounds that the only witness, Lady Jane Seymour, had since died of tuberculosis and could not testify, and that the anonymous clergyman who had performed the ceremony could not be found. Without witnesses, without a clergyman, and without the sovereign's consent, the marriage was, in the eyes of the law, null and void. The children born of it were bastards. It was a devastating verdict, delivered with the cold precision of a queen who understood that the greatest threat to her throne was not a foreign army, but a domestic marriage. The political logic behind Elizabeth's fury was clear enough. Catherine Grey, as the granddaughter of Henry VIII's sister, had a strong claim to the succession, arguably a stronger claim than Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the granddaughter of Henry's other sister. If Catherine's marriage to Hertford was recognised as valid, and if their son, Edward, Lord Beauchamp, was recognised as legitimate, then there existed a ready-made Protestant alternative to the Catholic Mary Stuart. The marriage of a potential queen to the son of a former Lord Protector, both of them Protestant, both of them with royal blood in their veins, was the kind of thing that could destabilise a reign. And Elizabeth knew it. But the story did not end there. Despite being confined separately in the Tower, Edward and Catherine somehow managed to continue their marital relations, probably with the connivance of Sir Edward Warner, the sympathetic lieutenant of the Tower, who allowed secret visits between the two prisoners. It was an extraordinary act of defiance, or of love, depending on how one reads it, and its consequences were predictable. In February 1563, Catherine gave birth to a second son, Thomas, in the Tower. The Queen was apoplectic. Warner was dismissed from his post and punished. The couple was separated permanently, and they never saw each other again. Catherine spent the remaining years of her life in a succession of private houses, under the watchful eye of guardians appointed by the Queen. She was never officially imprisoned after her release from the Tower in 1563, but she was never truly free either. A woman in limbo, unable to live with her husband, unable to claim her place in the world, and unable to do anything except wait and hope for a change in the Queen's heart that never came. She fell into a deep sadness that her contemporaries recognised as something like despair, and her health declined steadily in the years that followed. Catherine Grey died on the 26th of January, 1568, still in captivity. She was 27 years old. It was said that she died of grief. A romanticised diagnosis, perhaps, but one that captured something real about the slow wasting away of a young woman who had been denied everything she wanted. Hertford was eventually released from the Tower and allowed to return to court, but the stigma of his secret marriage followed him for the rest of his life. His sons remained legally illegitimate, and their claim to the succession was never recognised. Edward Seymour, the first Earl of Hertford of the second creation, lived on until 1621, dying at the remarkable age of approximately 81. He had been a serial maker of secret marriages. After Catherine Grey's death, he married twice more, both times in secret, and his life was marked by the same pattern of romantic boldness and political miscalculation that had characterized his father's generation. He was buried in Salisbury Cathedral, but the Seymour family's entanglement with secret marriages and the Tower of London was not yet finished. In the next generation, the pattern repeated itself, more dramatically, more tragically, and with consequences that reached all the way to the throne. Edward's grandson, William Seymour, born in 1588, was a young man of modest ambitions and unremarkable talents who happened, by accident of birth, to possess one of the most dangerous things in early 17th century England: a claim to the throne. Through his grandmother, Catherine Grey, William was descended from Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor, and he was therefore, depending on how one counted the various claimants and their relative merits, somewhere between 4th and 6th in line for the English crown. This would not have mattered much if William had married a woman of ordinary birth. But the woman William fell in love with was Lady Arbella Stuart, and Arbella was, in the eyes of many, an even stronger claimant to the throne than William himself. Arbella was the daughter of Charles Stuart, the Earl of Lennox, and she was a direct descendant of Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister who had married the King of Scotland. She was, in the language of the time, a princess of the blood, a woman whose marriage, like Catherine Grey's before her, was a matter of state concern. King James I, who was Arbella's first cousin, and who had himself come to the throne through the same branch of the Tudor family tree, saw the union of two claimants to the throne as an intolerable threat. The marriage of William Seymour, who carried the blood of Henry VIII's sister Mary, to Arbella Stuart, who carried the blood of Henry VIII's sister Margaret, created a couple whose combined dynastic claims were, on paper at least, stronger than the king's own. It was exactly the kind of match that Tudor and Stuart monarchs had spent generations trying to prevent. And James reacted with the predictable fury of a king who felt his crown being threatened from within his own family. When William and Arbella were secretly married on the 22nd of June 1610 at Greenwich, the king's response was swift and merciless. William was condemned to imprisonment in the Tower of London, making him, remarkably, the fourth member of the Seymour family in 5 generations to be confined within its walls. Arbella was placed under house arrest, and the couple was forbidden from seeing each other. The sequel was worthy of a romance or a tragedy, depending on one's point of view. In June 1611, both William and Arbella managed to escape their respective places of confinement. The plan was simple in conception and heartbreaking in its execution. They would make their way separately to the coast, rendezvous at a prearranged point, board a ship, and flee across the Channel to the continent, where they could live together in freedom beyond the reach of the English crown. William made it. He reached the port of Leigh-on-Sea, boarded a boat, crossed the Channel, and arrived safely at Ostend in the Spanish Netherlands. From there he made his way to Luxembourg, where he lived in modest exile for several years, waiting for the day when he might be reunited with his wife. But Arbella was not so fortunate. Her escape was discovered, and although she too managed to reach the coast and board a ship, the vessel was intercepted in the Channel by a pinnace sent by the king. She was captured, returned to England, and placed once more in the Tower of London, this time with no prospect of release. She never saw William again. She never saw anyone again except her guards and the servants who attended her in her prison. Arbella Stuart died in the Tower of London on the 25th of September, 1615. She was 39 years old. The precise cause of her death is uncertain. Some contemporaries believed she had starved herself, whether deliberately or as a consequence of the mental illness that seemed to overtake her during her long imprisonment. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Another woman who had dared to marry a Seymour without permission had been destroyed by the forces that such a marriage inevitably set in motion. William Seymour, meanwhile, survived. He returned to England after Arbella's death and eventually rehabilitated himself at court. He married again, this time to Lady Frances Devereux, the daughter of the Earl of Essex. And when the English Civil War broke out in 1642, he fought for the king as a royalist commander. It was not a brilliant military career, but it was a loyal one, and his loyalty was eventually rewarded. The story of the Seymour family does not end with the Tower of London, or with the execution of the Lord Protector, or with the death of the boy king. It continues, through war and exile and restoration, through one more generation and then another, until the golden wings that had appeared on the family's coat of arms in the 13th century were raised once more to a dukedom. William Seymour had spent his life navigating the treacherous currents of English politics with a patience and a persistence that his Tudor ancestors would have recognized. He had been imprisoned, exiled, widowed and impoverished, but he had never given up his claim to the honor and the dignity that were, as he saw it, his family's birthright. After Arbella's death, he had returned to England, been pardoned by the king, and quietly rebuilt his life. In 1617, he married again, this time to Lady Frances Devereux, the daughter of the famous Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex, who had been executed for treason under Elizabeth I. It was, one might say, a marriage between two families who understood the cost of ambition and the price of royal displeasure. William inherited the earldom of Hertford from his grandfather in 1621, and in the decades that followed, he rose steadily in royal favour, serving as a privy councillor and as a guardian to the young Prince Charles, the future King Charles II. When the English Civil War broke out in 1642, William did not hesitate. He declared for the king and served as a royalist commander in the west of England, raising troops, garrisoning towns, and fighting a war that was, in many ways, the final chapter of the great constitutional and religious struggles that had begun in the age of Henry VIII. William was not a great general. His military career was marked more by loyalty than by brilliance, and the royalist cause in the West was ultimately doomed by the superior organisation and resources of Parliament. But William's fidelity to the crown never wavered, even as the royalist cause collapsed, even as the king was captured, tried and executed in 1649, and even as England became, for a brief and extraordinary period, a republic under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. Through the years of the interregnum, the period between the execution of Charles I in 1649 and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, William lived quietly, waiting as his ancestors had waited for centuries, for the wheel of fortune to turn. He was an old man now, in his 70s, and he had seen enough of history to know that nothing lasts forever, not even a republic. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and Charles II returned to England in triumph, William Seymour was among those who benefited most from the new order. The young king, grateful for William's decades of loyal service, recognized his sacrifices by granting him the ultimate reward, the restoration of the title that had been forfeited more than a century before. William Seymour became the second Duke of Somerset, the first since his great-grandfather had been executed on Tower Hill in 1552. The circle was complete. The title that had been won by one Edward Seymour through political manoeuvring and royal favour, and lost through political miscalculation and the executioner's axe, had been recovered by his descendant through loyalty, endurance, and the patient turning of history's wheel. It had taken 108 years, a civil war, a republic, and a restoration, but the golden wings of the Seymour family were raised once more to the highest rank of the English peerage. William did not enjoy his restored title for long. He died on the 24th of October 1660 at Essex House in London, and was buried at Great Bedwin in Wiltshire, not far from the old Seymour heartland around Wolf Hall and Savernake Forest. He was succeeded by his grandson, another William, who became the third Duke of Somerset, but who died young in 1671 at the age of 19, unmarried and without children. The dukedom passed to William's uncle, John Seymour, who became the fourth Duke, and who also died without male heirs in 1675. The succession then moved to a distant branch of the family, and from this point forward the story of the Dukes of Somerset becomes a quieter, less dramatic tale. A story of landed wealth, parliamentary politics and the steady management of a great estate, rather than of queens and protectors and midnight break-ins to the king's bedchamber. But the family endured. Through the 17th century, the 18th, the 19th, and into the 20th, the Seymour Dukes of Somerset maintained their title, their lands, and their place in the English peerage. they intermarried with other great families. They served in Parliament. They improved their estates, built new houses, and managed the ancient forest of Savernake, the same forest that their ancestors had guarded since the days of Maur 6 centuries before. The dukedom of Somerset remains in the Seymour family to this day. It is one of the oldest and most storied titles in the English peerage, and its holders can trace their ancestry back through a chain of marriages and inheritances that stretches from the present day all the way to the Norman settlers who first established themselves at Penhow Castle in the 12th century. It is a lineage that encompasses queens and kings, protectors and prisoners, soldiers and scholars, heroes and villains, and one quiet girl from Wiltshire who changed the course of English history by catching a king's eye. Let us pause here near the end of our journey and consider the extraordinary arc of the Seymour story. It begins in the shadows of the Welsh border, among minor lords and small estates, and a castle that few people had ever heard of. It rises, slowly and patiently, through centuries of careful marriages and loyal service, until the family stands at the edge of the forest where the king comes to hunt. It erupts, suddenly and violently, into the most dramatic period in English history. The age of Henry VIII, of the English Reformation, of the break with Rome and the dissolution of the monasteries, and the 6 wives and the boy king, and the executioner's axe. And then, just as suddenly, it subsides. The queen is dead, the protector is dead, the admiral is dead, the king is dead, and the baby has vanished. And the family sinks back into the quieter rhythms of English life, diminished but not destroyed, waiting for the wheel to turn once more. It is a story that could only have happened in England, and it is a story that could only have happened in the 16th century. That brief, violent, extraordinary period when the old medieval world was dying and the modern world had not yet been born, when the power of kings was absolute and the ambitions of men were boundless, and when a single marriage, a single birth, or a single death could change the course of a nation's history. There is something in the Seymour story that speaks to the nature of power itself. How fragile it is, how quickly it comes and how quickly it goes, and how the families that hold it are shaped and scarred and sometimes destroyed by the experience. The Seymours did not seek power. It was thrust upon them by the accident of Jane's beauty and Henry's desire, and they were consumed by it in a single generation. Edward Seymour reached for the highest office in the land and was destroyed by his own arrogance and by the jealousy of men who were, in many ways, no better than he was. Thomas Seymour reached for even more, for the Queen, for the Princess, for the King himself, and was destroyed by his own recklessness and by the inability to see that charm and ambition, without judgment, are weapons that cut the hand that wields them. And Jane, the quiet girl at the centre of it all, gave everything she had, her youth, her health, her life, for a son she held in her arms for 12 days before the fever took her away. Each of them, in their own way, was undone by the very thing that had raised them. Jane's virtue attracted a king, and the king's desire killed her. Edward's competence made him protector, and the protectorate made him enemies he could not defeat. Thomas's charm won him a queen, and the attention of a princess, and his inability to know when he had enough brought him to the scaffold. The golden wings that carried the family upward were the same wings that carried them into the fire, and yet the family survived. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. Through execution and imprisonment, through attainder and exile, through the loss of titles and lands, and the slow, grinding humiliation of watching lesser families occupy the positions that had once been theirs, the Seymours endured. They married again. They raised children again. They served the crown again. And in the end, after 108 years, after a civil war, after the execution of a king and the rule of a military dictator, they got it all back. The golden wings still fly. The Seymour family still exists. The forest of Savernake still stands, ancient and vast, at the edge of the Wiltshire Downs. And somewhere, in the chapel at Windsor, Jane Seymour lies beside the king who loved her best. The country girl from Wolf Hall who gave England its heir and its future, and who paid for it with everything she had. Rest now. Let the names and the dates and the stories settle softly around you, like leaves falling in an old forest. The Seymours have had their time in the light, and the light has faded, and the house is quiet. The fire burns low, the candles flicker, and the long, strange story of the family from Wolf Hall, the family that rose from nothing, ruled everything and lost it all, drifts away into the gentle dark. Sleep well, and good night.